cinematic story begins. The spotlight hit Johnny Cash's face as he stood on a makeshift stage in British Columbia Penitentiary, 1974. Razor wire and concrete walls surrounded him, but something about this crowd felt different. Beneath the usual restless energy ran a current of something darker, pain that music alone couldn't touch. Halfway through Folsom Prison Blues, he noticed the man in the back row. While everyone else sang along, this inmate sat completely still, tears streaming down his weathered face. Not cathartic tears, but the broken tears of someone confronting something unbearable. The man's name was Thomas Garrett. Watching him weep silently while hundreds of other inmates celebrated would become the moment that reminded Johnny Cash why he'd spent his career singing to people society had forgotten. Sometimes a song doesn't just entertain. Sometimes it breaks something open that's been sealed too long. What happened next would take Johnny on a journey about the ways we abandon the people who need us most and whether those abandonments can ever be undone. The performance started like any other prison show. Security checks, briefings about dangerous men, warnings to maintain distance. Johnny nodded through it, knowing the guards misunderstood. He wasn't there to judge or fear these men. He understood the distance between him and them was smaller than most people believed. He had his own darkness, the pills, arrests, nights he couldn't remember. He'd been in cells, felt judgment, understood being defined by your worst moments. When he sang to prisoners, he sang with them. The set list was familiar. Songs about trains, loneliness, missing home. Between songs, Johnny talked like they were old friends. He told stories about his failures, his addiction, times he'd disappointed people who believed in him. But Thomas Garrett sat rigid, hands gripping his knees, tears flowing. Johnny kept performing, but part of his attention stayed on that broken man. Thomas's stillness amid movement suggested confrontation with something specific and devastating. When Johnny started singing A Boy Named Sue, the song that had become one of his biggest hits, Thomas's composure finally shattered completely. His shoulders began shaking with sobs he could no longer control. The men sitting near him noticed, shifting uncomfortably, unsure whether to help or give him space. And Johnny, watching from the stage, understood with sudden clarity that this song, this story about a father who abandoned his son, had struck something in Thomas that went far beyond entertainment. The song was meant to be funny, ironic, a tale of an absent father who left his son with a terrible name as a twisted form of preparation for a hard world. But Johnny had always known that beneath the humor ran a current of genuine pain about absent fathers and the damage they leave behind. Watching Thomas Garrett weep, he realized that for some people in that room, the song wasn't comedy at all. It was documentary. After the final encore, while his band packed up equipment, Johnny did something he rarely did. He asked the warden if he could speak with the man who'd been crying in the back row. The warden hesitated, citing regulations about inmate contact, but something in Johnny's expression made him relent. 10 minutes later, Johnny Cash sat across from Thomas Garrett in a small meeting room, separated by a table but connected by an understanding that transcended the barrier. Thomas was 53, 8 years in prison for armed robbery. Before that, construction worker, husband, father. The husband part ended in divorce. The father part ended worse. "I got a son," Thomas said, voice rough. "David. I ain't seen him in 17 years. I left when he was 8. Told his mama I was going for cigarettes and never came back. I was drinking heavy, couldn't keep a job, couldn't stand seeing disappointment in his eyes. Thought he'd be better off without me." The rationalization was familiar. The lie that leaving is love rather than cowardice. That song, A Boy Named Sue. Thomas continued, hands trembling. "My boy's name is David Thomas Garrett. I gave him my name before I left. Listening to you sing about a father who abandoned his son, I realized that's all I left him. Just a name. No guidance, no protection, nothing. This wasn't about music anymore. This was about wreckage we leave behind when we run, and whether any of it can be rebuilt." "Where is he now?" Johnny asked. "Your son." "I don't know," Thomas said, and the admission broke him again. "I got no right to know. I gave up that right when I walked out. But sometimes, lying in my cell at night, I wonder if he's okay. If he thinks about me. If he hates me, or if he just forgot I ever existed. After leaving, Thomas drifted through menial jobs and temporary relationships, drinking away guilt until drinking became the only reliable thing. The armed robbery was desperate, poorly planned. He'd walked into a convenience store with an unloaded gun, been arrested within an hour, felt relief when they locked him up. But tonight, hearing Johnny sing about fathers and sons, something cracked open. The protective numbness around his guilt fractured. 17 years of suppressed grief poured through. "I don't expect forgiveness," Thomas said. "I don't even think I deserve to ask for it. But I wish I could just tell him I'm sorry. That leaving him wasn't his fault. That every day since has been punishment because I can see his 8-year-old face asking when Daddy's coming home, and I know the answer is never." Johnny thought about his own children, years lost to drugs and ego, the rebuilding he'd done to earn back their trust. He thought about the power he had beyond performance. "What if I could find him?" Johnny asked. "Your son, David. What if I could find him and arrange for you to talk? No promises about his reaction, but at least give you the chance to say what you need to say?" "Why would you do that?" Thomas whispered. "You don't owe me nothing." "Because somebody did it for me once," Johnny said. "Because I know what it's like to fail the people you love. And because sometimes a song is just entertainment, but sometimes it's a reminder that we're all carrying damage, and maybe we get a chance to repair some of it." The search took 3 months. Johnny hired a private investigator, used industry connections, made dozens of calls. It became a quiet obsession between recording sessions and tours. The investigator found David in Seattle, 25, elementary school teacher, married with a daughter. He'd changed his last name to Walsh at 18, erasing the connection to the man who abandoned him. Johnny wrote a letter instead, a careful explanation of meeting Thomas, an invitation to consider contact if David was willing. No pressure, no expectation. He mailed it and waited. 6 weeks later, his phone rang at midnight. "Mr. Cash? This is David Walsh. I got your letter." They talked for 2 hours. David's story poured out. Waiting for his father, slow realization he wasn't coming back, shame of being abandoned, the rage that fueled his teenage years, the promise he'd made to never become that kind of man. "I built my whole identity around not being him," David said. "And now he wants to talk? After 17 years? Johnny didn't try to convince him. He just listened. "I'm not telling you what to do," Johnny said finally. "Your father doesn't deserve forgiveness just because he asks. But maybe talking will give you both a chance to put down some of that weight." Long silence. Then, "Okay." Setting up the call took another month navigating prison bureaucracy. The warden allowed it, convinced by Johnny's persistence. Thomas spent the week before barely eating or sleeping, writing and rewriting what he'd say. Johnny insisted on being present, sitting with Thomas as the call was placed. The phone call lasted 43 minutes. Johnny sat across from Thomas, watching the man's face cycle through every emotion a human being could experience. Terror at hearing his son's voice for the first time in 17 years. Shame as he tried to explain the inexplicable. Grief as he acknowledged what he'd destroyed. And finally, tentatively, something that looked like relief as his son spoke back. Not with forgiveness exactly, but with acknowledgement. Johnny couldn't hear David's side, but he could infer it from Thomas's responses. The questions were hard. "Why did you leave? Did you ever think about coming back? Do you know what you did to Mom?" "To me?" Thomas answered with brutal honesty, stripping away rationalizations and excuses. He admitted his cowardice, his selfishness, his complete failure. He didn't ask for understanding. He just told the truth. The guards who'd escorted Thomas to the phone room stood against the wall, watching this broken man confront his past. One of them, a veteran officer who'd worked prisons for 20 years, would later tell Johnny that in all his time, he'd never witnessed anything quite like it. The raw honesty, the lack of defensiveness, the willingness to simply sit in the pain of what he'd done without trying to escape it. Near the end, Thomas's voice broke completely. "I know I got no right to say this, and I'll understand if you never want to talk to me again, but I need you to know. Leaving you is the worst thing I ever did. Worse than the drinking, worse than the crime that put me here, worse than anything. and not a day goes by that I don't wish I could go back and be the father you deserved instead of the coward I was." He listened to whatever David said in response, tears streaming, and then whispered, "Thank you. Thank you for giving me a chance to say that." When the call ended, Thomas sat holding the receiver long after the line went dead. Johnny waited, giving him space to process. Finally, Thomas looked up, exhausted but somehow lighter. "He didn't forgive me," Thomas said. "I didn't expect him to, but he listened, and he told me about his life, his wife, his daughter, my granddaughter. He said maybe we could talk again sometime. Not promises, just maybe. And that's more than I ever thought I'd get." The experience affected Johnny more deeply than he'd anticipated. That night, alone in his hotel room, he called his own children, all of them, even the ones he hadn't spoken to in months. He didn't explain why, just told them he loved them and was grateful they'd given him chances to rebuild what his addiction had damaged. His daughter Roseanne asked if he was okay, hearing something unusual in his voice. He told her about Thomas and David, about witnessing a reconciliation that might never have happened without intervention. "Do you think they'll be okay?" she asked. "I don't know," Johnny admitted, "but at least now they have a chance. Sometimes that's all anyone needs. Just a chance to try." The story of what happened in that Canadian prison in 1974 didn't make headlines. There was no dramatic reunion, no tearful embrace, no Hollywood ending. Just two broken people beginning the slow, difficult process of acknowledging the damage between them and deciding whether any of it could be repaired. Thomas and David continued talking, sporadically at first, then more regularly. The conversations were never easy. David had years of anger to work through, and Thomas had to face his failures without deflecting. But they kept showing up for those calls, kept trying to build something from the rubble. The process wasn't linear. There were setbacks, calls that ended in anger, weeks when David couldn't bring himself to pick up the phone. Thomas learned patience he'd never possessed before, understanding that rebuilding trust wasn't about grand gestures, but about consistent small acts of showing up. He wrote letters when David didn't want to talk, sharing pieces of his life in prison, never asking for responses, just offering connection. Johnny stayed in touch with both men. He visited Thomas twice more before his release in 1979, watching the man transform from someone consumed by guilt to someone learning to live with it productively. Thomas started volunteering in the prison's education program, helping younger inmates earn their GEDs, telling them about the cost of abandoning responsibilities. When Thomas was released, it was David who helped him find housing and a job. Not out of obligation, but out of a hard-won decision that his father's past mistakes didn't have to define their future relationship. They met in person for the first time in 21 years at a diner in Portland, halfway between Seattle and where Thomas had settled in Eugene. Johnny attended that meeting, sitting in a booth across the restaurant, watching nervously like a parent at a child's first day of school. He saw Thomas walk in, older and grayer, but standing straighter than he had in prison. He saw David stand up, this young man who'd built a good life despite abandonment, and extend his hand to his father. Not a hug, not yet, but a handshake. A beginning. The experience changed how Johnny thought about his music and purpose. He'd always known songs could connect emotionally, but watching A Boy Named Sue crack open Thomas Garrett's defenses showed him that music does more than reflect pain. Sometimes it forces us to confront it. He started writing differently. Songs like Hurt and The Man Comes Around carried new weight, deeper acknowledgement of mortality, regret, and the desperate human need for redemption. Critics noticed the shift, the rawness that made even covers feel like confessions. They attributed it to aging, health struggles, natural evolution. But Johnny knew it started in a Canadian prison, watching a broken man weep at recognition of his failures. He also changed how he approached prison performances. Before Thomas, they'd been powerful but somewhat routine. After, each show became an opportunity to see individuals rather than crowds. He'd scan faces, looking for people who weren't just entertained, but affected. Sometimes he'd ask to speak with specific inmates after shows, these brief conversations becoming a kind of ministry he'd never intended but couldn't abandon. In 1985, Johnny established a small foundation that helped connect incarcerated parents with their children, providing resources for phone calls, letters, and eventually reunification support. He never publicized it widely, didn't want it to become about him, but prison reform advocates knew about it, social workers knew about it, and most importantly, families torn apart by incarceration knew about it. He funded it quietly, personally, treating it as seriously as any album release or tour. When asked why he did it, he'd tell the story of Thomas and David, though he still changed their names to protect their privacy. He'd talk about the responsibility that came with reaching people through music, and the ways artists could either use that power carelessly or wield it with intention. The foundation helped over 1,500 families before Johnny's death in 2003, facilitating conversations that might never have happened otherwise. Some led to reconciliation, some led to necessary closure. All of them gave people a chance to say what needed saying, which is sometimes the most important thing we can offer each other. In interviews, when asked about his prison performances, Johnny often told the story of Thomas and David, though he changed their names to protect their privacy. He talked about the responsibility that came with reaching people through music and the ways artists could either use that power carelessly or wield it with intention and compassion. "I sang a song that night thinking it was just another show," he'd say. But for one man in that audience, it was the moment everything changed. That's when I understood that we don't always know what our work means to people. We just put it out there and hope that when it matters, when someone needs it, it finds them. Thomas Garrett died in 1995 at 74. By then, he'd been out of prison 16 years, worked as a carpenter, rebuilt something real with his son. David spoke at the funeral, a complicated eulogy acknowledging both damage and repair. He mentioned Johnny Cash, the stranger whose intervention started the process of reconciliation. Johnny attended, sitting in the back, bearing witness to the ending of a story he'd helped shape. Afterward, David found him in the parking lot. "I want you to know something," David said. "I became a teacher because of you." Johnny looked surprised. "Because of me?" "Because you showed me that the most important thing is showing up for people when they need it, even if you don't have to, even if it's complicated. You could have just sung your songs and left that prison and never thought about my father again. But you didn't. You saw someone suffering and decided to help. That's what I try to do now, every day, with my students. Show up for people who need it." Over his 30-year teaching career, David Walsh taught over 800 students. Many came from broken homes, absent fathers, backgrounds similar to his own. He understood their pain in ways other teachers couldn't, and he made it his mission to be the stable adult presence some of them lacked at home. 3 of his former students became teachers themselves, citing his influence. One started a mentoring program for children of incarcerated parents. The ripple effect of compassion, spreading outward from one prison concert in 1974, touching lives Johnny would never know about. That's the real magic of intervention, not the immediate impact, but the cascading consequences across decades and generations. The legacy of that night in British Columbia Penitentiary wasn't just the reconciliation between Thomas and David Garrett. It was the ripple effect of compassion, the way one decision to help a stranger can cascade through lives in ways we never see or understand. David's students, hundreds of them over the years, were shaped by a teacher whose empathy had been partially modeled by a country singer who'd cared enough to find a missing son. And Johnny carried that story with him for the rest of his life, a reminder that music was powerful, yes, but human connection was the real magic. Songs could open doors, but people had to choose to walk through them. He'd given Thomas a door. Thomas had chosen to walk through it. And somewhere in that choice was the answer to the question that had haunted Johnny throughout his career. Did any of this matter beyond entertainment and commerce? Could art actually save people? The answer, he learned, was yes, but not in the dramatic, singular way people imagined. Art saved people slowly, quietly, by giving them permission to feel things they'd been suppressing, by reflecting their pain back to them in forms they could finally process, by creating moments where change became possible, even if it wasn't guaranteed. Johnny Cash sang to save lives. Not literally, not like a doctor or a firefighter, but in the sense that sometimes the right song at the right moment could crack open a prison of shame and denial, and in that cracking, create the space for something like healing to begin. That was enough. More than enough. That was everything. The song that accidentally saved a life wasn't written for that purpose. It was a novelty track, meant to make people laugh and tap their feet. But Thomas Garrett heard in it the story of his own failure, and instead of running from that recognition, he chose to face it. And in facing it, he got his son back. Not perfectly, not easily, but genuinely. That's the power of art when it intersects with human need at exactly the right moment. It doesn't fix everything, but it opens a door. And sometimes a door is all someone needs.